The office on the top floor of the glass tower in downtown Charleston offered a stunning view of the harbor. But that evening, Ryan Castle wasn't looking at the dark horizon of the Atlantic. He was looking at a small black velvet box he held tightly in his palm, turning it between his fingers with a nervousness he rarely allowed himself in his life as a successful businessman. In exactly 10 days, he planned to propose to Jenna Dumont, the woman he'd spent the last 2.5 years with, the first person in his adult life who had managed to earn his complete trust. No small thing for a man who, at 38, ran one of the most important real estate development groups in the Southeast, and who had learned, at the cost of painful lessons, to view every gesture of affection with an almost reflexive suspicion. Blake Warren, his best friend, and the company's chief operating officer, walked into the office without knocking, as he usually did, finding Ryan lost in thought, still holding the box. "Still not sure?" Blake asked, sitting down in the chair across from the desk, knowing him well enough to immediately recognize the turmoil on his friend's face. "I'm sure I love her," Ryan said, with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. "But I'm not sure, Blake, whether I can fully trust that her reasons are as pure as my feelings." Blake sighed, already knowing where this conversation was headed, a discussion they'd had in different forms countless times over the years. "Because of your stepmother," Blake said, more a statement than a question. Ryan nodded bitterly. 12 years earlier, his father, Charles Castle, had remarried a much younger woman, Larissa, who turned out just a few years after the wedding to be interested exclusively in the family's considerable fortune. The divorce that followed, full of lawsuits and painful revelations about Larissa's true motives, had deeply scarred Ryan, then a 26-year-old just taking over the family business, teaching him a lesson he would never forget: that wealth could attract just as easily as it attracted sincere admiration, a completely fake form of affection, impossible to distinguish from the real thing, except through time and sometimes extreme circumstances. "Jenna isn't Larissa," Blake said gently. "I've known her 2.5 years, Ryan. I've watched her refuse expensive gifts from you in the early months of your relationship. I've watched her insist on paying half the bill, even at the most expensive restaurants. If anyone's sincere in her feelings, it's Jenna." "I know," Ryan said, rubbing his face with his hands. "But I need absolute certainty, Blake, not just encouraging signs. I want to know beyond any doubt that she'd love me just as much even if I didn't have a dime, even if everything collapsed tomorrow." Blake fell silent for a moment, sensing where his friend was heading, a direction he'd suspected for a while but had hoped he could avoid. "You're not seriously thinking about what I think you're thinking about," Blake said, with a trace of worry in his voice. "I want to test her," Ryan said directly, confirming his friend's fears. "I want to tell her I lost everything, that the business went bankrupt, that we have to sell the house and move into a small apartment. I want to see how she reacts, whether she stays by my side or suddenly finds reasons to pull away." "Ryan, that's a terrible manipulation," Blake said bluntly, not hiding his disapproval. "If Jenna really loves you, which I believe she does too, this lie will hurt her deeply, no matter the outcome of your test. And if, God forbid, it turns out her motives aren't pure, you'll destroy a 2.5-year relationship through a scheme you wouldn't even have needed to pull off, because the truth would have come out sooner or later anyway." "I need that certainty before I put a ring on her finger," Ryan insisted, with a stubbornness Blake had seen many times before, usually in the toughest business negotiations. "My father needed 12 years and a devastating divorce to learn the truth about Larissa. I want to know now before we take the most important step of our lives." The conversation dragged on for hours, with Blake trying unsuccessfully to convince Ryan to abandon this risky plan. But his friend's resolve remained unshaken, fueled by a toxic combination of old trauma and a perfectionism that refused to accept any trace of uncertainty in the most important decision of his life. "Since you're going to do it anyway," Blake said finally, resigned, "at least let me help you do it as painlessly as possible for her. And promise me that no matter the outcome, you'll tell her the truth as soon as possible. You won't let this lie drag on indefinitely." "I promise," Ryan said, though deep down he wasn't entirely sure how long this test he was determined to carry out would actually last, convinced that only absolute, extreme proof could give him the peace of mind he needed to take the step toward marriage without a shadow of doubt. The plan took shape over the following days. Ryan would gradually announce to Jenna a series of increasingly serious company problems, culminating in news of a complete bankruptcy, supposedly caused by a bad investment and the sudden withdrawal of an important financial partner. Blake, with the help of a trusted lawyer, would prepare fake documents convincing enough to support the story, while Ryan's real fortune would be temporarily and discreetly moved into accounts and investments that no one outside the small circle in on the plan would be able to discover. The impressive house on the waterfront, where Ryan and Jenna had lived together for almost a year, would be sold through a fictitious transaction with a company also controlled by Blake, and the two of them would move into a small rented apartment in Mount Pleasant, a space completely different from the luxury Jenna had gradually grown used to over the past 2.5 years, but which would become, without her ever suspecting the truth, the stage for a test meant to put to the ultimate proof, in a way Ryan hoped with all his heart would be fair, the full depth of the love she felt for him. "Ryan, are you okay? You've seemed exhausted the past few days," Jenna said one evening, sitting down next to him on the couch in the living room of the waterfront house, a cup of tea in her hands, looking at him with the sincere concern that had defined her since the beginning of their relationship. The moment he had planned so carefully had arrived, and Ryan felt his stomach tighten with a guilt he tried to mask under an expression of authentic worry. Not hard to fake at all, because, in truth, part of him really did fear the consequences of the lie he was about to tell. "We've got a serious problem with the company," he said, his voice trembling slightly, not entirely performed. "The investment in the Northside project isn't going anywhere near as planned, and one of our financial partners is threatening to pull out completely." "How serious is the situation?" Jenna asked, her voice calm, but her eyes full of a worry that didn't seem tied to her own financial interests at all. "It could be very serious," Ryan said, avoiding her gaze. "We could lose considerable amounts, might even have to restructure the whole company." Jenna took his hand in hers, a simple gesture, but full of an affection that made Ryan feel even guiltier about the scheme he was taking part in. "Whatever happens, we'll get through it together," she said, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Money comes and goes, Ryan. What really matters is that we're together." In the weeks that followed, Ryan continued gradually building the image of an ever-deepening financial crisis, bringing home fake documents, having carefully staged phone conversations with Blake about increasingly serious problems, watching closely for Jenna's reaction to every piece of bad news he shared with her. Her reaction remained consistently the same: sincere concern for his emotional well-being, repeated offers of practical help, and not a trace, not the slightest trace, of any attempt to distance herself or question the future of their relationship because of the increasingly severe financial problems. The climax of the scheme came on a Friday evening, when Ryan announced to Jenna, in a voice torn by a pain he no longer had to fully act out because it had somehow become authentic through the constant repetition of the script, that the company had officially gone bankrupt. "We have to sell the house," he said, his eyes wet. "We need to move somewhere smaller, much smaller. I have almost nothing left, Jenna. Everything I built over the last 15 years collapsed in a single month." Jenna stayed silent for a few long moments, and Ryan felt his heart pounding, waiting for the reaction that would confirm or dispel every fear he'd accumulated over the years. "Then we sell the house," she said finally, with a calm determination that deeply surprised Ryan. "We move wherever we need to. I have a small apartment inherited from my grandmother in Mount Pleasant. It's not big, but it's mine. No rent to pay. We can stay there as long as you need to rebuild the business." Ryan felt guilt flood his chest, realizing for the first time truly the magnitude of the sacrifice Jenna was willing to make for a completely fabricated crisis, a crisis that had absolutely no connection to the reality of his financial life, carefully hidden in accounts and investments she had no way of suspecting existed. The move into Jenna's modest apartment happened within just a few days, and Ryan discovered, with a mix of amazement and growing shame, a completely new side of the woman he thought he already knew deeply. Jenna gave up nearly all her personal expenses without hesitation, started working overtime at the accounting firm where she was employed, and, to his complete astonishment, sold her family jewelry, inherited from her mother, to contribute to what she believed were their shared survival expenses. "Oh, you didn't have to do that," Ryan said one evening, finding Jenna carefully counting the money from selling the jewelry, a modest sum, but clearly significant for the financial situation she believed they were going through together. "Family helps out in hard times, Ryan," she said simply, without a trace of regret in her voice. "Those jewels are worth nothing compared to you, to us, to the future we want to build together." Her words, spoken with absolute sincerity, hit Ryan with a force he hadn't anticipated, making him wonder, for the first time since the start of this risky plan, whether he might be making a terrible mistake, testing a love that was proving, with each passing day, to be far deeper and more sincere than he could have ever imagined, even in the most optimistic scenarios he'd considered before starting this complicated and increasingly, evidently, deeply risky scheme from an emotional standpoint. A month had passed since the company's bankruptcy, and Ryan and Jenna's life in the modest apartment in Mount Pleasant had settled into a routine Ryan never would have believed he could truly live, accustomed as he was to the comfortable luxury of the waterfront house. They slept in a small bedroom with a single window, facing an inner courtyard with no view at all, cooked together in the tiny kitchen with only 2 working burners on the stove, and counted night after night the day's expenses. A routine Jenna managed with a calm competence that constantly amazed Ryan. One evening, coming home earlier than usual, Ryan found Jenna asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on her arms, completely exhausted after a long day of overtime at the accounting firm, followed by a few hours spent cleaning a nearby office, a second job she'd taken without telling Ryan, hoping to manage it discreetly without worrying him further. He woke her gently, with a tenderness weighed down by the ever-growing guilt he carried. "Since when are you cleaning offices?" he asked her, with genuine worry, not remotely faked this time. Jenna blinked sleepily, then smiled tiredly, without a trace of shame in her look. 2 weeks, she said. "I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd be upset, but we need extra money, Ryan, and I can work a few extra hours without any problem." "Jenna, you can't keep doing this," he said, taking her hands in his. Hands he now noticed for the first time truly, roughened and cracked from cleaning products used without protective gloves. "You're going to completely burn yourself out." "We're a team, Ryan," she said with gentle firmness. "I'm not going to let you go through this alone just because I'm lucky enough to have good health and the energy to work more for a while." That night, while Jenna slept exhausted beside him, Ryan lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the unfamiliar apartment, overwhelmed by a guilt that was beginning to feel more and more like an acute form of moral suffering. In their increasingly frequent conversations of the past few weeks, he had discovered details of Jenna's past he had never truly known, despite being together for almost 3 years. "I never told you about my brother," she confessed to him one evening, as they ate a simple homemade soup by the light of a single candle, because the kitchen bulb had burned out, and they still couldn't afford to buy a new one. "Ryan, my little brother Andrew, needed expensive medical treatment 6 years ago before I met you. I worked 3 jobs at once for almost 2 years to help pay for his treatment. I gave up the master's program I wanted to do, put off basically all my personal dreams." Ryan listened, his heart tightening, to a story of sacrifice and determination he'd never suspected lay behind the serene, always smiling woman he'd known over the past few years, surrounded by the comfort and calm afforded by his considerable fortune. "Why did you never tell me about this?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Because I didn't want it to seem like I was fishing for sympathy," Jenna said simply, "or like I was trying to draw some connection between my past hardships and your current financial situation, as if I wanted to show you I know what it's like to go through hard times. I just wanted to support you, Ryan, without turning everything into a story about me." Ryan's guilt grew even deeper when, a few days later, his mother, Susan Castle, who hadn't been told about the scheme, called worried, having heard the bankruptcy news from a mutual acquaintance in the business world. "Ryan, what's going on with the company? Why didn't you tell me anything?" she asked him on the phone, in a voice full of genuine maternal concern. Ryan hesitated, caught in a lie that was beginning to spread far beyond the boundaries he'd originally imagined, now forced to lie to his own mother as well to keep the whole fabricated story consistent. "It'll be fine, Mom," he said evasively, feeling the web of lies he'd built become harder and harder to manage, closer and closer to collapsing under its own weight. During that same period, Blake began voicing his concern about the scale the test had taken on ever more openly. "Ryan, I think this has gone too far," he told him at a discreet meeting at the office where Ryan continued to secretly manage his real business. "Jenna's working 2 jobs. She's sold her family jewelry. She's confessed things about her past to you that she's probably never told anyone else. I think it's time to tell her the truth before something irreversible happens." "A few more weeks," Ryan said, though even to himself his own voice sounded less and less convincing. "I need absolute certainty, Blake. I can't risk stopping the test now, right before I get the complete certainty I want." But deep down, Ryan already felt with an increasingly heavy clarity that the certainty he was searching for had already been demonstrated, and then some, by every sacrifice Jenna had made without hesitation over the past few weeks, and that the only thing that still remained uncertain in this whole complicated story was his own ability to find the courage needed to put an end to a lie that had begun to cause suffering far more real and profound than he could have ever imagined. 2 days later, Ryan finally decided to end the scheme. He'd spent the previous night completely awake, replaying every moment of the past few weeks, every sacrifice Jenna had made, every overwhelming proof of a love he had put to the test in a way he now considered not just risky but downright cruel. He planned to confess everything that very evening, preparing himself for the hardest conversation of his life, a conversation in which he would have to admit not just the lie, but the depth of his own insecurity, inherited from an old trauma he had let dictate a decision whose consequences he was only now beginning to fully understand. But before he could put this plan into action, Jenna came home earlier than usual, her face drawn with an exhaustion that went far beyond the usual physical fatigue of the past few weeks. "What happened?" Ryan asked, worried, immediately noticing her clearly fragile emotional state. Jenna sat down on the edge of the bed, staring off into space, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with a vulnerability Ryan had never seen in her before. "My boss at the cleaning company told me today I have to choose," she said, her eyes wet. "Either give up the accounting job for a more flexible schedule with them, or give up the cleaning job completely. I can't keep doing both anymore, Ryan. I'm so exhausted I almost fell asleep at the wheel today driving over here." Ryan felt his heart stop for a moment, the horror at the thought that his test might have led to a real danger to the life of the woman he loved washing over him instantly. "Jenna," he said, moving closer to her, ready to begin the confession he'd prepared, but she kept talking, unable to stop, the words now pouring out like a torrent of emotions bottled up in silence for weeks. "I don't regret working this hard for us," she said, with a conviction that held even through the tears. "I'd do it again 1,000 times for you. But sometimes at night I think about my dreams, about the master's program I put off again, about the life I imagined before all of this happened, and I feel so guilty for thinking about my own needs while you're going through such a serious crisis." Ryan felt something finally break inside him, any trace of justification for continuing this lie, collapsing completely under the weight of the authentic suffering he had unwittingly caused the woman he claimed to love above all else. "Jenna, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice trembling. But at that exact moment Jenna's phone rang and she, quickly wiping away her tears, answered, assuming it was some call related to one of her 2 jobs. Ryan watched her expression change completely as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line, an expression that quickly moved from confusion to a deepening shock. "What do you mean Ryan's company never went bankrupt?" he heard her say, her voice growing sharper with disbelief. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face, realizing with horror that someone somehow had learned the truth before him, completely destroying his plan to reveal it himself in his own way, with the explanations he'd prepared so carefully. "Who is it?" he asked in a voice almost inaudible, though he already suspected with a searing certainty who could have found out and revealed the truth. Jenna hung up the phone, her hand trembling, looking at Ryan with an expression he would never forget. A devastating combination of disbelief, pain, and an anger just beginning to take shape. "That was Corinne," she said, referring to a former college friend who now worked as a business journalist. "She read a public financial report from your company, published last week, showing record profits for the last quarter. She called to ask if I was okay, because she'd heard rumors about the company's financial troubles, but the official numbers say something entirely different. Ryan stayed silent, unable to find a single word that could in any way ease the devastating weight of the moment that had just erupted. A moment he desperately hoped to control, to manage carefully with prepared explanations, but which now exploded completely beyond his control, brutally exposing him, with no preparation at all, in front of the woman he had hurt far more deeply than he could have ever imagined. "Ryan," Jenna said, her voice almost a whisper but sharp as a knife, "tell me it isn't true. Tell me there's some explanation for all of this, other than the one I'm thinking right now." Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but no word came out, his own guilt and shame completely suffocating his ability to answer, letting that oppressive silence confirm, more clearly than any explanation could, the terrible truth Jenna was just beginning to suspect. "It's true," Ryan said finally, his voice broken, unable to bear that unbearable silence any longer. "The company never went bankrupt, Jenna. I lied. It was all a setup." Jenna stood up abruptly from the bed, her movements stiff, mechanical, as though her body was trying to physically process a shock her mind still refused to fully accept. "A setup," she repeated in a voice completely devoid of emotion, a tone that scared Ryan far more than any furious scream could have. "Explain it to me, Ryan. Explain to me exactly what kind of setup made me sell my mother's jewelry, work 2 jobs to the point of complete exhaustion, confess to you the most painful secrets from my past." Ryan felt every one of her words hit him like a slap, painfully deserved, while he tried to find a way to explain the logic behind his decision, a logic that, spoken aloud now, in the face of her devastating pain, sounded even to himself completely absurd and unjustifiable. "I wanted to be sure," he said, his voice trembling, "that you loved me for who I am, not for my fortune. My father went through a devastating divorce with a woman who turned out to only be interested in his money, and I needed absolute certainty before taking the step toward marriage." "So you tested me," Jenna said with a searing bitterness. "You turned me into an experiment, Ryan. You built an elaborate lie, let me suffer, exhaust myself, sell my family heirlooms, all of it for an insecurity you got from your father's trauma, not from me, not from anything I ever did to give you reason to doubt." "Jenna, please," Ryan said, moving closer to her, but she stepped back instantly, a movement that expressed more clearly than any words how deep the rupture he had caused truly was. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice now trembling with an anger she had held back with difficulty until that moment. "Do you have any idea, Ryan, what I'm feeling right now? Not just the pain of betrayal, though that's terrible enough on its own. I also feel the humiliation of realizing that everything I did, every sacrifice I considered proof of my love for you, was actually just the performance you were watching, the grades you were secretly giving me for a test I didn't even know I was taking." "It wasn't a performance to me," Ryan said with growing desperation. "It was the most beautiful proof of love I've ever seen, Jenna. That's exactly why I wanted to tell you the truth tonight, before you found out from someone else. I'd finally realized how wrong everything I did was." "But you didn't manage to do it fast enough," Jenna said, with a finality in her voice that chilled Ryan to the bone. "I found out from a former colleague, through a random phone call, instead of hearing the truth from your own mouth, when you would have actually had the courage to do it." Jenna quickly gathered a few personal belongings into a bag, her fast, decisive movements betraying a determination Ryan no longer dared to challenge. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "I'm going to my sister's," Jenna said without turning to look at him. "I need time away from you, Ryan, away from all this elaborate lie you built knowingly to test my love, as if I were some lab specimen, not the woman you wanted to marry." "Jenna, my love for you is real," Ryan said, desperate. "The ring, the proposal I'd planned, all of that was real." Jenna stopped in the doorway, finally turning to look at him directly, with an expression in which pain and anger mixed with an overwhelming sadness. "Maybe your feelings were real, Ryan," she said, her voice calmer now but all the more devastating for that cold calm. "But real love doesn't need to test its partner through elaborate lies and intentionally inflicted suffering. Real love is based on trust, not on secret checks meant to confirm or disprove a suspicion you carried with you from your own past, not from ours. She left, leaving Ryan alone in the modest apartment that ironically had become, over the past few weeks, fuller of authentic warmth than the luxurious waterfront house had ever been. A warmth he himself had destroyed through his own desperate need for absolute certainty. Blake arrived at the apartment an hour later, called by a desperate message from Ryan, finding his friend sitting on the floor of the tiny kitchen, completely crushed by the weight of the consequences his own actions had caused. "I told you you were going too far," Blake said gently, sitting down next to him on the floor without a trace of further reproach in his voice, just genuine sadness for his suffering friend. "I destroyed the most precious thing I had in my life," Ryan said, his voice broken by a pain he had never felt with such intensity before, trying through a lie meant to confirm a love that deep down he already knew was real. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating evening. 3 weeks during which Ryan, contrary to his initial impulse to run after Jenna, immediately, desperately begging for forgiveness, had chosen, on Blake's insistent advice, to fully respect her need for space and time, however painful that wait was for his own soul, crushed by guilt. "If you run after her now," Blake had told him in those first terrible days, "it's going to look exactly like a continuation of the manipulation she accused you of. Extra pressure put on her shoulders right when she needs space to process everything the most. Give her time, Ryan. Show her through quiet actions, not desperate words, that you've truly understood the weight of your mistake." Ryan had followed this advice with painful discipline, refusing to send Jenna repeated messages or show up unannounced at her sister's door, where he knew she'd temporarily moved. Instead, he channeled all his energy and guilt into a series of quiet gestures, meant not to win her forgiveness through manipulation or pressure, but simply to repair as much as possible part of the harm he had caused. The first thing he did was investigate through a trusted lawyer the real financial situation of Jenna's younger brother, Andrew, the one who had needed the expensive medical treatment 6 years earlier. He discovered that the Dumont family still had a considerable debt to the private hospital where the treatment had taken place, a debt Jenna had been paying off partially in small installments for years, without ever mentioning to Ryan the financial burden she was still quietly carrying from that difficult period in her family's past. Ryan paid off that debt in full, through an anonymous donation to the hospital, carefully structured so it couldn't be traced back to him, a gesture he made not to earn Jenna's forgiveness, but simply because he had finally truly understood the depth of the sacrifices she had been quietly making for years, for her family. He also bought back the jewelry Jenna had sold during the fabricated crisis, tracking down through discreet channels the pawn shop where it had ended up, and had it shipped by courier directly to her sister's address, with no note, no explanation, no request for a meeting or a conversation, just a small card that simply said, "I'm sorry. This belongs to you, no matter what happens between us." The news about the jewelry inevitably reached Jenna, who, to her own surprise, didn't feel the anger she'd expected, but rather a deepening confusion about Ryan's true intentions. "I don't know what to think," she confided to her sister Michelle one evening, looking at the box of jewelry she'd received with no further explanation. "Part of me is still angry, deeply hurt by the lie he told me. But the other part, I don't know, Michelle. This gesture feels completely different from the rest of the manipulation. It feels sincere, in a way I can't fully explain." "Maybe you should talk to him," Michelle suggested gently, not necessarily to forgive him right away, but at least to hear what he has to say, face to face, not through silent gestures and short notes. Jenna hesitated for several days, wrestling with conflicting emotions, but finally, almost a month after the devastating breakup, she sent Ryan a short message. "We can talk. The coffee shop by the harbor. Tomorrow at 6. Ryan arrived at the meeting 20 minutes early, his heart pounding so hard it was almost hard to breathe normally, running through, for the 100th time, the words he wanted to say, though he already knew no rehearsed speech would be enough to fully express the regret and transformation he'd gone through over the past few weeks. Jenna arrived right on time, looking more tired than Ryan remembered, but also with an expression of calm determination that suggested she'd come to this meeting with an emotional clarity he hadn't fully reached yet. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Ryan said, his voice trembling as they sat down at a secluded table in the coffee shop. "I need answers, Ryan," Jenna said directly with no roundabout introduction. "Not necessarily to forgive you, but at least to truly understand why you felt the need to do what you did." Ryan told her, with a sincerity he had never allowed himself before, the whole story of his trauma tied to his father's devastating divorce, about the insecurity he'd carried for years regarding his own ability to distinguish real love from financial interest in disguise, and about how that insecurity, fueled by a trauma that had nothing to do with Jenna, had pushed him toward a decision he now fully recognized as wrong, regardless of the initial intentions behind it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me now," he said finally, his eyes wet. "I realize how deeply I hurt you, and I know that repairing that wound will take far more than words or isolated gestures. But I want you to know, with all the sincerity I'm capable of, that I deeply regret every day of that lie, and that if you ever gave me a second chance, I would spend the rest of our lives proving to you, through constant actions, not tests or secret checks, that my trust in your love is complete and unconditional." Jenna listened in silence, tears slowly running down her cheeks, and when she finally spoke, her voice was full of a vulnerability that suggested, for the first time since their breakup, a fragile trace of hope for a possible way forward. "I can't promise you everything will go back to how it was," Jenna said, her voice still trembling with emotion. "You shook something fundamental in my trust, Ryan, and fully repairing that trust is going to take time, maybe far more time than either of us would like. But I think I'm willing to try with small steps with a lot of patience on both sides to see if we can rebuild something real from the wreckage of what you destroyed." Ryan felt an immense weight finally begin to lift off his shoulders, though he knew with a clarity he hadn't had before starting this painful experience that the road ahead would be long and marked by difficult moments, necessary for the authentic rebuilding of a trust he himself had destroyed through his own insecurity. "I have one condition," Jenna added, with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "Never in any way do you test my love again through lies or setups. If you ever have doubts or insecurities, Ryan, I want you to come straight to me so we can talk openly. Like two adults in a relationship built on honesty, not build elaborate scenarios meant to check my feelings behind my back." "I promise," Ryan said, with a deep conviction that came from a complete understanding only now truly reached of the mistake he had made. "And I think I should look into therapy too, Jenna, not just for our relationship, but for myself, for the old trauma tied to my father's divorce, which I've carried for too long without truly dealing with it, letting it dictate decisions I now clearly see as deeply wrong." Jenna smiled, for the first time since the start of that difficult conversation, a fragile but sincere smile that gave Ryan the first real ray of hope since that devastating night. "I think that would be a really good step," she said gently. In the months that followed, Ryan held strictly to the promises he'd made that evening at the coffee shop by the harbor. He started regular individual therapy sessions, patiently working through the complicated layers of his trauma tied to his father's divorce, gradually learning to distinguish between insecurities inherited from someone else's past and the present reality of his own relationship. Jenna, in turn, moved back gradually, not right away, but through a slow process of rebuilding their intimacy, starting first with regular meetups, then with weekends spent together, and finally with the shared decision to live under the same roof again, this time in a new apartment, chosen together, completely neutral, with no connection to either the old luxury house or the modest apartment of the lie, a space that symbolized, for both of them, a fresh start built on far more solid foundations than the previous ones. Ryan also used a significant portion of his fortune to fund, completely and with no strings attached, the master's program Jenna had put off twice because of life circumstances, a gesture they discussed openly this time, together, as part of a joint decision about their future, not as a secret compensation meant to make up for unresolved guilt. A year after that devastating night of confession, Ryan proposed to Jenna again, this time without a trace of any test or hidden scheme, in a moment completely free of artificial grandeur. A simple Sunday morning walk along the Battery in Charleston, exactly the place where they'd walked countless times over the past 3.5 years, a silent witness to their whole story, with its painful ups and downs, but also with the authentic healing they'd managed to build together. "There's no hidden test this time," Ryan said, kneeling on the promenade battered by the sea wind, pulling from his pocket the same black velvet box he'd carried with him, without the courage to use it more than a year before. "I just have the simple, sincere question I should have asked from the very beginning, without a shadow of doubt or manipulation. Jenna, will you be my wife?" Jenna, tears of joy running down her cheeks, nodded with a yes, spoken with a conviction that left no room for any doubt, a conviction built not on tests or secret checks, but on entire months of honest work, shared vulnerability, and a love that, despite the terrible test it had endured, had proven in the end to be exactly as real and deep as Ryan had ever hoped to find. Ryan and Jenna's story became, within their close circle of friends, a living example of how authentic trust can never be built through manipulation or secret tests, but only through constant honesty, shared vulnerability, and a willingness to work together through one's own insecurities and traumas, no matter how deeply rooted they are in each person's past. Dear friends, we hope Ryan and Jenna's story touched your heart the way it touched ours while we wrote it. If this story's emotion won you over, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel and hit like to help us keep bringing you stories about trust, forgiveness, and the true nature of unconditional love. Every day we prepare new stories, just as full of emotion and unexpected twists, so don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of what's coming. We'll be waiting for you in the comments to hear which part of Ryan and Jenna's story moved you most, and we can't wait to see you again for our next story.